Greetings and welcome to the Jar of Manna Bible Podcast. This is your host, Alfred Martinez. I thank you for joining us today. We are continuing in our studies of the book of Exodus. We've been working through Exodus chapter 1 through 40, and today is Exodus chapter 11. If you're new with us, you can go back to the channel and you can catch up with us, and all of the previous videos will be on there that'll get you to this point. If you're returning, I thank you, and hopefully you've been enjoying this study and you've been learning new things. And we're going to continue in our journey today. We're going to read through the chapter of Exodus 11. I got a few verses that I'd like to highlight. We can learn a few new things, and hopefully this will be encouragement and edifying to your studies. This chapter is not very long. There is only 10 verses, so it shouldn't be too long of a video. But next week, we'll be going through Exodus chapter 12, which is the highlight or the climax of the whole book of Exodus, which is the Passover and actually the actual Exodus account when the people leave Egypt. So we'll go through that next time. So as we before we get started, I kind of wanted to just go over a few items that we left off from last week, which is Exodus chapter 10. And Exodus chapter 10 was the 8th plague, which was the locusts, and also the 9th plague, which is the darkness. So we covered those two plagues in the previous episode, and I'll go more in depth on those two plagues, where we have Moses and Aaron going to Pharaoh by the command of Yahweh that to let the people go, but Pharaoh is unwilling, and so the 8th and the 9th plague are set upon the people of Egypt. And what we've noticed is that also that although these plagues are set upon the people of Egypt, and they're very destructive plagues, the people of the Hebrews, God's people, the Israelites, are not subject to these plagues. They're in Goshen, and when, for example, when the locusts came through and ate all of the plant life and whatnot, the people in Goshen were protected. They were not hindered in a way that the Egyptians were. And you'll see that if you went back to chapter 10. And then also with the darkness, there was darkness throughout the land, so dark that you couldn't see each other for 3 days. And you do see this, that it even mentions that it was so dark that you can feel it. However, the people dwelling in Israel, it said that there was light in their dwellings, that God was still within his people, preserving his people, that they were not being affected by these plagues. Now, they were affected by the first few plagues that you read about, but the latter plagues, not so, they were not. So we ended with a conversation with Moses and Pharaoh, and I'll share that with you real quick. So we ended in a conversation with Pharaoh, was speaking to Moses. And at the end, verse 27 says, "But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not let them go. Then Pharaoh said to him," which is Moses, "Get away from me, take heed to yourselves, and see my face no more, for in the day you see my face, ye shall die." So Moses said, "You have spoken well, and I will never see your face again." That's the end of chapter 10. But when we get into chapter 11, there's a continuation from this this account, and we'll read from this. We'll read down the entire chapter, and we'll come back up. So with that said, let's go ahead and start in chapter 11. So before we get started, I'm going to go ahead and encourage you to get your scriptures out with you. If you have your own Bible, feel free to follow along. If you don't, you can just read on the screen. I'll share it on my screen, or you can just listen. I'll be reading out of the New King James Version, and we'll just start there. So here we go, Exodus chapter 11. "And the Lord said to Moses, I will bring one more plague on Pharaoh and on Egypt. Afterward, he will let you go from here. When he lets you go, he will surely drive you out of here altogether. Speak now in the hearing of the people, and let every man ask from his neighbor, and every woman from her neighbor, articles of silver and articles of gold. And the Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. Moreover, the man Moses was very great in the land of Egypt, in the sight of Pharaoh's servant, and in the sight of the people. Then Moses said, Thus saith the Lord, about midnight I will go out into the midst of Egypt, and all the firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne, even to the firstborn of the female servant who is behind the handmail, and all the firstborn of the animals. Then there shall be a great cry throughout all the land of Egypt, such as was not like it before, nor shall it be like again. But against none of the children of Israel shall a dog move its tongue against man or beast, that you may know that the Lord does make a difference between the Egyptians and Israel. And all these your servants shall come down to me and bow down to me, saying, Get out, all the people who follow you. After that I will go out. Then he went out from Pharaoh in great anger. But Yahweh said to Moses, Pharaoh will not heed you, so that my wonders may be multiplied in the land of Egypt. So Moses and Aaron did all these wonders before Pharaoh, and the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not let the children of Israel go out from his hand. So what we have here is the chapter of 11, and like I said before, it's a continuation from chapter 10. However, chapter 10 ended where there's a conversation where Pharaoh tells Moses to leave, and I won't see your face again or anymore. But yet we just read that as if he was going to go and speak to Pharaoh one more time. So what we have here in the beginning verses of chapter 11 is what is sometimes referred to as a parenthetical, which means it's parenthetic, and it refers to a revelation made to Moses before he actually was present with Pharaoh. So it's an interaction that is describing before he goes in, even though it's after the conversation. So that's all that's going on here. There's just a couple of just a description, a little bit more description of what was spoken of before he went, and then here's that description playing out. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we'll go back into chapter 11 and go through some of these verses, and wanted to pinpoint out a few things that we saw or that I noticed here. So let's start at the top. One thing I wanted to mention was verse 3, and the Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. That kind of just relates back to verse number 2, because it says, Speak now in the hearing of the people, and let every man ask from his neighbor and every woman from her neighbor articles of silver and gold. And what we see here is basically is that God has given favor to the Hebrews. So if we go back to Exodus chapter 3, we read that Yahweh the Father had mentioned that he was already going to give favor to the people, that he already had it in his plan that when this situation comes up, he's going to give them favor. And if you read here, verse 21 in Exodus chapter 3, it says, And I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, and it shall be that when you go, that you shall not go empty-handed. Okay, so that gets played out in Exodus 11 that we're reading now, that the favor from the Egyptians is coming to fruition, that articles of silver and gold they will receive. And we'll actually see that in chapter 12. In chapter 12, we do see that actually this did happen. I'll skip there real quick. 12, verse 35 and 36. Don't want to get too much into 12 because we'll go over that next time. But it says here, now the children of Israel had done according to the word of Moses, and they had asked from the Egyptians articles of silver, articles of gold and silver and clothing. And the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, and so that they granted them whatever they requested. So you see that happening in chapter 12. The mention was in 3, 11, and then we see that in 12. And God is giving his people favor, right? Obedience comes blessings, and that's a portion of their blessings that will get played out. So now I wanted to go ahead and move on to the next verse, which is the next verse I'd like to talk about, which is verse 4. And it says that, So then Moses said, Thus saith the Lord, about midnight I will go out into the midst of Egypt, and all the firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne, even to the firstborn of the female servant who is behind the handmill, and all the firstborn of the animals. So here's this is the plague. This is the description of this plague that's going to come, that all of the firstborn are going to be consumed, and they shall die. That's what it says here. But it said, what I wanted to focus on is at the beginning, it says, at about midnight, I will go into the midst of Egypt. So this is Moses. Well, this whole situation is God is telling Moses to go to Pharaoh. But when you read this verse 4, it reads as Moses is telling Pharaoh that thus saith the Lord Yahweh, that he will go out into the midst of Egypt. So when you read this, it appears that, okay, God's going to be the one going out, which he is, but he sends forth his messenger or his agent to do his business. And I wanted to show that to you because there is some clarity that we do see that who actually is the one going out, because when we get to chapter 12, I'll go there again real quick. We'll read this when the event actually happens. Chapter 12, verse 23. I'm going to skip there real quick. For the Lord, this is Exodus 12:23. For the Lord will pass through to strike the Egyptians. And when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the two doorposts, the Lord will pass over the door and not allow the destroyer to come into your house. So it does say the Lord will pass through, the Lord's going through, but this is interesting. It says he will not allow the destroyer, as if it's another being come into the house to strike you. Now, the reason why it says that is because it's one of God's agents that is actually doing the business of the Lord. It's the Lord that is giving the command, and he says, I'm going to go through, but it's actually his agent, which is an angel that is going to be the destroyer, and he's going to be the one that's coming through. And the Apostle Paul understood this, and he wrote about this in the New Testament, and that's in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And I'll take you there real quick, and we can see what Paul the Apostle wrote in his letter to the Corinthians. He writes, he's talking about Old Testament examples, but he says here, now verse 10, I'm sorry, nor complain as some of them also complained and were destroyed by the destroyer. If you go into a couple of different translations, it may actually say not only the destroyer, but it was like, for example, in this version, it will say, and they were killed by the destroying angel. And some of the translations do say angel. Most of them do say destroyer, but you can see that it's as if it's a different being that's going through. And in Hebrews chapter 11, we also see that the writer of Hebrews, also in the New Testament, mentions the same passage in a similar tense. Hebrews 11 verse 28, he says that by faith he kept the Passover, talking about Moses, and the sprinkling of the blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should also touch them. So it's also again, in a couple of different translations, it might say, so that the one destroying, or that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch Israel's firstborn. So you have this description that he's actually called the destroyer, but it's referring to one of God's agents, which would be one of the angels that has received this task from Yahweh to go and do the instructions. So we move on to verse 7, another interesting verse. It says, but against none of the children of Israel shall a dog move its tongue against man or beast, that you may know that the Lord does make a difference between the Egyptians and Israel. So, here's just another indication that the Lord does make a distinction about who's his and who isn't his. And so the Egyptians are referred to here as, well, I'm sorry, the Hebrews or the Israelites are referred to God's possession, because that there's going to be a distinction between Egypt and Israel, the Egyptians and the Hebrews. This plague is going to come upon the Egyptians, and it's not going to come upon those who obey Yahweh's commandments. So that destroying angel that we'll read about in chapter 12, when he comes through, those that have obeyed Yahweh, he's just going to pass right over. That's what the description of the description of the Passover means. He's going to pass right over those that obeyed, but he will destroy those that don't obey. So we'll see that in the next chapter, verse 9. But the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh will not heed you, so that my wonders may be multiplied in the land of Egypt. So Moses and Aaron did all these wonders before Pharaoh, and the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not let the children of Israel go out from his hand. So to sum up this chapter, we have Moses and Aaron continuing to be faithful from the commandments of God, to go to Pharaoh, to be prophets. And we have the rebellion of Pharaoh, that his heart is continuously being hardened more and more as time goes on, because of his unwillingness to obey the commandments of God. That's basically what it is. And so God has given him many chances, and his heart is getting harder and harder, and he's unwilling to obey the commandments of God. Therefore, these plagues are coming upon him. So that's the end of the chapter today, everyone. Chapter 11, just again, 10 verses, not too much of a chapter. Hope you learned a few things, but we'll get into chapter 12 next session, and we'll go through the actual event of the Passover, where the angel does come through. God has given orders to obey, and then we'll see who obeys and who doesn't obey, because that death angel is going to come through and take and kill the firstborn. So come to us next time. Hope you'll be back. We could get back in the swing of things, and we'll continue with chapter 12. Thank you for joining today, and I hope you have a blessed night, and that the Lord may be upon you.